First of all, I see that we have a lot of guests joining us online. Welcome to the Spring Honor Seminar. In this seminar, we have a different faculty member come in and present research or some big idea that they have. It's just an opportunity for faculty members and researchers at King to have an audience to present their research to and get feedback. Thank you. The objectives of the seminar, what we hope to achieve by this is a enriched interdisciplinary dialogue, opportunities for student-faculty collaboration, and overall just to expand the academic horizons of our honor students by introducing them to ideas and professors that they would not have an opportunity to engage in otherwise. That's what we're doing here, and I'm really thrilled to see all the I don't know, getting some feedback here. If you are joining us online, please, if you're not talking, keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute. But of course, during question and answer period, or if you have a question during the presentation, feel free to turn on your mic and camera then. So that's what we're about. Welcome to the Spring Honor Seminar. We're going to be doing this every week, a different professor, a different topic, different research. Always free to join. You're always free to join us. The campus is always invited. We like to speak of this as a think tank of sorts, and hopefully, as you engage the Spring Honor Seminar more in the semester, you'll know what I mean. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Jody Helbert as our first speaker of the Spring Honor Seminar. Dr. Helbert decided to for health and safety reasons, decided to join us via the internet tonight, or online presentation. So this is a first for the seminar as well. So far, so good. We'll see how that goes as well. So anyway, Dr. Helbert, are you with us?
I am, and thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
You're very welcome. We're thrilled to host you. Tell us, Dr. Helbert, where were you? Where are you from? Where were you raised?
I grew up in Eastern Kentucky in a very small town in Pikeville, near Pikeville, in that area.
Oh, great. And how'd you tell us your story about how you ended up in social work?
Okay. Well, it wasn't my first choice. In fact, I didn't really even know what social workers did until many years later. My first degree is in civil engineering, so it's a far afield from where I am now. But I always wanted to help people and to counsel people, and I had no idea at that time until I started to research that social workers perform the majority of mental health work in the United States. About 70% of the mental health care counselors are social workers. So that's where I started, and I practiced in psychotherapy for years before moving into academia, and then I kind of did both, and now I'm, still do a little bit of therapy occasionally, but for the most part, I'm fully academic.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know you were practicing psychotherapy. That's.
Mm-hmm.
So how'd you end up on the academic side of the house then?
I decided I wanted to teach a class on addiction. So I started to, so I reached out to a university and they wanted me to come teach. And so I thought, this is wonderful because what social workers want to do anyway is to make a broad impact. And a broad impact starts with the education piece. So I moved into that, and I kept my practice, but I would back and forth. I'm teaching a little, I'm practicing still. So I find all of those areas fulfilling.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we're glad you entered the higher education and glad you're at King for sure. What do you do for fun? What are your hobbies?
Well, I live on the lake and I love to swim. I have a boat, so I take the boat out and those kinds of things. I really, really like to travel. Um, and I collect foreign money. So wherever I go, I collect a piece of currency from there. And when my friends travel, they bring money back to me. And um, but that's it primarily. Travel is on my list. I have lots of places still to go.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Helbert to the honors podium.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. As you know, Dr. Streetman said, I'm Dr. Jody Helbert. I'm the program coordinator in the BSW program. BSW is Bachelor of Social Work. I'm also a professor in the program, so I teach in the program as well. And like I said before, one of my social work roles, social work is a very broad field, so there's lots of things we can do with a degree in social work. So one of my roles has primarily been as a psychotherapist. And in addition to treating like a broad range of mental health issues, I've also worked in addictions treatment. And as many of you may know, we have a huge problem here in Northeast Tennessee and in Southwest Virginia, so much so that it's referred to as an epidemic. So tonight, I want to talk to you about the disease processes of addiction and how those affect the brain and that sort of thing. And so this talk is dedicated to the many people who've been fighting this disease. And so I enjoy an interactive discussion, so I'll ask questions of you, and so I want you to please ask questions during the talk if you have questions that arise. All right, so it can start innocently with an injury or an illness, possibly trying to ease pain, and maybe the pain returns before the next scheduled dosage. So you take another pill and another, and maybe another before the pain abates. Before you know it, you can find yourself in the throes of an addiction. Now, addiction doesn't always start out like that, but one reason that people start using is because they're trying to stop some form of pain, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional pain. And so before we can begin to try to understand any kind of concept, it's a good idea to first define it. So what is addiction? The American Society of Addiction Medicine says that addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and all those related circuitries. So dysfunction in these circuits can lead to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. So in social work, we use a term that we call biopsychosocial spiritual. So when we assess people in all those arenas. So here's yet another similar definition, and this one comes from the National Institute on Health's Drug Abuse Center. Addiction is defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use, despite any harmful consequences. So addiction is considered to be a brain disease because mood-altering substances change the brain. They change its structure and they change how it works, how it functions. And so these changes can be long-lasting and they can lead to many harmful behaviors, often very self-destructive behaviors. Well, according to the CDC, addiction is a complex disease, often chronic in nature, which affects the functioning of the brain and the body. It also causes serious damage to families, to relationships, to schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. So you've heard three definitions now. Are you seeing a common theme in all of these three definitions? So we can see that from these, that addiction is a chronic disease. And so sadly, the treatment for addiction is often quite acute, which may account for the high relapse rates in addiction, relapse is not the exception, it's the norm. So addiction is a disease, and so therefore it's not relevant to issues like choice, to ethics or morals or willpower or concepts like strength. So people with the disease are often asked, why can't you just stop? But from a scientific standpoint, that's not a reasonable request once this disease has taken control. So there are lots of symptoms that coincide with addiction, and so I'm going to just list a few here that are kind of common ones. So the severe loss of control. The addiction literally hijacks the thinking brain. People continue to use despite some serious consequences. This is, lots of things are falling apart, but they continue to use. They're in the throes of an addiction. People are often preoccupied with using, so the addiction literally drives them. And then some symptoms may include some failed attempts to quit. Remember, I said that relapse potential is great with addiction. And because addiction is progressive, it's also characterized by tolerance and withdrawal. So when you think of addiction, what are some things that come to mind? Like, what types of addictions do you know about?
Alcohol addiction and narcotic addiction.
Yes. Okay, mood altering substances. So alcohol for sure, cannabis, cocaine, meth. Have you guys heard of meth mouth? Do you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that? And I'll come back to that, but heroin, what else? What are some other types of addiction, substance addictions and other types?
Cocaine, heroin, gravel, anything that's mind altering in itself, but then there's also other addictions when it comes to synthetic drugs as well.
Yes. All right. And many of those are just vicious in their ability to create addiction. And so I mentioned before, have you heard of meth mouth? Have you guys heard that?
Yes.
All right. So the user's teeth decay and they fall out. And the reason for this is because meth inhibits the salivary glands of the mouth, and a dry mouth causes your teeth to die and then they fall out. So what are some other kinds of addictions other than substances?
When it comes to, what is it? Anything can actually be an addiction. You can be addicted to losing weight, or addicted to eating, or caffeine, specific foods. Some people oddly have their strange addiction could be eating chalk or stuff that you wouldn't normally eat. And then there's also sex addictions, and I mean, there's all kinds of addictions specifically.
There are a ton. Thank you. Rich information. So people can be addicted to other people even. They can be addicted to the internet. That's very common. But gambling and food and sex and shopping. And what about this one? Shoplifting. People can be addicted to that. They get a dopamine hit when they steal something. So scientists have identified over 30 million substances. So we're talking about substances here that can affect the brain. And of those 30 million substances, less than 100 have the potential to cause the disease of addiction. Just a tiny fraction. So these things, when they're used in excess, can reach a degree of pathology that's life disrupting. I always say that anything in excess is bad, so everything should be in moderation. So we have to be very cautious, because just like our guest said, that lots of things can become addictive. So negative consequences will likely occur in some area of functioning despite your best efforts to stop the behavior. So for the sake of time, I'm going to limit our talk to mood-altering substances and the addictions that form in relation to them. All right, so not just any disorder can be called a disease. In fact, there are 3 primary criteria that any disorder must meet to be classified as a disease. Can anyone name even one?
Like one drug?
No. What can make a disorder be classified as a disease?
When it permanently alters their mind?
Okay. So in scientific terms, we say it must be detrimental. So it must cause some kind of damage to that person's life. Is addiction detrimental?
It can be, depending. Because from where it does change the chemicals of the brain, there's actually one specific statement that people have used before where someone is, quote unquote, permafried or dope sick, where it has changed the chemicals so bad to where their body their brain is not able to produce the dopamine or the serotonin anymore. There's a physical response to it.
Yes, very good, very good. So I would say that addiction is highly detrimental because it's not even just the physical symptoms, but all the social ramifications and lots of other ways that make it detrimental. So it also, to be classified as a disease, it must have a set of signs and symptoms that are really distinctive. And so we discussed some of those on the previous slide, so I'll move forward. And then the third criteria to meet the disease classification is that a disease must have it must produce a consistently abnormal test. So is there an abnormal test for addiction? Okay, the answer is yes. It's a brain scan called a functional MRI. It produces an abnormal test that indicates addiction. So an fMRI shows just the functional aspects of the brain, unlike some other tests that may just show the structural view. fMRI shows the functional aspects. So brain cells use one energy source to power themselves, and that's glucose. The fMRI measures things that are reflections of glucose metabolism. And so the more active a brain cell is, the more glucose it uses. So it sort of lights up on a brain scan. And so brain scans are done from a top view and kind of like looking downward from the top. And so the front of the brain is here. You see the letter A there, and it's oriented like this with the front of the brain in this direction. And so the way that brain scans read is that different colors reflect different areas of overall brain activity. And the brighter the area, the higher the brain activity in that area. So in a healthy brain, the highest level of activity is in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the front part of the brain here. Okay, and just like on the other scan, the front part. And so there's a lot of activity in the mid part of the brain in a diseased or an addicted brain, because they're not using this front part so much. But this, you can see on this healthy brain, it almost fluoresces. It's so lit up. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what I've done. I went back to the wrong slide. Forgive me. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah. So we can see that there's a lot of activity in the mid part of the brain. And so that is indicative of this is where addiction typically shows up on a brain scan. So this abnormal brain scan is the key to understanding why people in active addiction can't just make a choice to stop using. So things like willpower and ethics, morals, and strength, those concepts are just removed from the realm of possibility. As I said earlier, all disorders are not classified as diseases. Is the coronavirus a disease?
No.
Is it detrimental?
Yes.
Yes. does it have a particular set of signs and symptoms?
Yes.
Is there an abnormal test that's always abnormal?
No.
Yes,
Yes.
there is. So so the coronavirus is a disease. So it meets all the classification for a disease. And the disease of addiction is an epidemic that runs parallel with this pandemic. All right. And so to understand why these highlighted areas of the brain are significant, let's talk about some functions of the brain. We're going to look at the sagittal view or the side view of the brain that will help us to kind of see all of those structures. And so here's one image, and back here is the cerebellum. And so this area deals with fine motor coordination. How many athletes do we have in the room?
Got some hands raised here.
I see some hands. Okay. So athletes have a very well-developed cerebellum. Okay. And then this area is the occipital lobe. This is where your vision comes from. So your images come through your eyes and they're changed into pictures in this area. And all across the top of your brain here are conscious functions. So gross movement and all your executive and intellectual functioning are controlled at these parts of your brain, the top part. So language acquisition, abstract thoughts, rational thoughts, reading, writing, arithmetic, everything that you learn originates here. And you're fully aware, fully conscious of these functions. So the bottom part of the brain down here, just above the spinal cord, these are referred to as the basal ganglia structures or the limbic system. You guys may have heard of the limbic system. And so a lot of what happens down here is mostly subconscious, meaning that you're not really aware of these functions. For instance, your hypothalamus is right here. It's regulating your blood pressure right now, as well as your pulse and your heart rate, your breathing, your digestion, your temperature control. So lots of things that they're primarily autonomic. You don't even have to think about them or you don't have to do anything. They just happen. And so there's lots of other structures down here, but the one that we're going to talk about is the nucleus accumbens. And there's where the nucleus accumbens is, a small little area of just a bunch of neurons. Does anyone know what some nicknames might be for the nucleus accumbens? Okay, how about the pleasure center? Have you guys heard of the pleasure center or the reinforcement center? Also, another nickname is the reward center. The nucleus accumbens has been implicated in addiction formation because it seems to really only have one function, and that's to get you to repeat any activity or behavior whose result is the stimulation of the neurons in the nucleus accumbens. It will drive you to repeat that behavior. Now, why would we have a part of our brain that does something like that? So the thinking is that it was intended to get you to repeat behaviors that will increase the likelihood of survival of the individual or the species. So it's there for your good. Sometimes you may hear it referred to as the primitive part of the brain, the reptilian part of the brain, because the only function is for your survival. And so there have always been certain behaviors that we know that are naturally salient behaviors, or that they're very important to your survival. So what are some things that might be very important to your survival?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the naturally salient stimulators are things that keep us alive. So what are some things that would be very essential to keep us alive? Some behaviors or things that we may have to do.
Critical thinking when it comes to what the body needs, specifically when it comes to water, shelter, clothing, food, self-preservation.
Yes, very good, very good. So the primary one is water. The next is food. Sleep is up there, and then sex or procreation. And so when we engage in these behaviors, the nucleus accumbens is stimulated, and it drives you to repeat those behaviors frequently because they're going to keep you alive. So which of these four are the most life-limiting if you don't repeat them?
Water, food.
Yeah, water. So you can only survive about 3 days without hydrating or taking in fluids of some kind. Our bodies are about 70% water, so keeping it hydrated is very important. The next most life-limiting, if not repeated, is food. And so these fall under the rule of threes. You can go about 3 days without taking in fluids and about 3 weeks without food, and you're a goner. Sleep is the next most life-limiting. Your brain gets hot during the waking hours, and it cools down while you sleep. And so our bodies regenerate itself during sleep. And so without sleep, though, people will become delirious and even begin to hallucinate, and eventually they die. So sex or procreation is the last of those four life-limiting behaviors. So if you don't procreate, your species will die out. All right, so there's some other things that also develop salience. Things like love and physical touch and family and your job, maybe, and religion. And these are in no particular order, but these things can become important enough that you're driven to repeat them. You go to church every Sunday, or you go to work every day. You spend time with your family and the people that you love. Human beings, as we know, are social beings. And so these things are very important to us. But once an addiction is activated, mood-altering substances supersede all of these naturally salient factors. In fact, most people who come into treatment are universally dehydrated. They're hungry, they're tired, and they're on the verge, if not over the edge, of losing their families, their jobs, their homes, everything. They've essentially lost the ability to make better choices. Someone said to critically think. Yeah, they've lost that ability to make good choices. And so now let's talk about the frontal lobes. And so remember, the frontal lobes are up here. And what do they do?
Decision making?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You're good at this. And so these are your socialization centers. They're the part of your brain where you learn everything about what your society and your culture believe are right versus wrong, good versus bad, acceptable versus unacceptable, and to a very strong degree, safe versus unsafe. And so the frontal lobes are where you learn all of your ethics and morals. You learn all that they are. These are learned behaviors and learned values of your culture. And I keep emphasizing that it's your, cultural views and your societal views, because they're different in different situations. And so if you lived in a society, or your culture, you were a member of a cannibalistic tribe, and your culture, your society viewed cannibalism as an acceptable practice, you would likely engage in that as well. In social work, we call this the person and environment perspective, or the ecological theory. And so we believe that cannibalism is wrong, but if you lived in a different culture, it would be, par for the course. And so ethics and morals are just that. They're learned values, and they vary from culture to culture. And so to make a choice, regardless of what that choice is about, people will go to their frontal lobes to make that decision between this choice or that, and whether it is right or wrong, good versus bad, acceptable versus unacceptable, or safe versus unsafe. All of this information is contained there in your frontal lobes. And so that's what making a choice is about. Essentially, Can you do what your frontal lobes say you should do? All right, so in a healthy brain, when you make a choice, you toss around ideas and you weigh some possibilities of this outcome versus another. And so your brain uses this complicated process where you're using your prefrontal cortex here and your ventral tegmental area here. We'll call this the VTA for short, in decision making. And your brain then chooses the most positive outcome, and then you just do that thing. And so in the disease of addiction, however, the function of the brain is altered. In a healthy brain, the most active area, which is the most dominant area, is the prefrontal lobes or the frontal lobes. When you're seeking to make the right choice, you go to your frontal lobes with considerations of your cultural norms and the things that you've learned, and you follow that, right? So, but in addiction, the frontal lobes are not doing very much. So a different part of the brain is activated and dominant because it's been habitually, which means repetitively, overstimulated to a massive degree by the mood-altering substance. The primary thing that all mood-altering substances have in common is that they overstimulate the reinforcement center to an abnormal degree, to a pathological degree. Remember what I said earlier, that its one function is to get you to repeat any behavior that stimulates it most. Mood-altering substances do this to a far greater degree, with a greater intensity and a longer duration than any of those naturally salient stimulators: water, food, sleep, sex, love, family, everything. So these substances take over. So the reinforcement center doesn't know that that's abnormal. So this is why mood-altering substances, we say it hijacks the thinking part of the human brain. It stimulates the brain more than all of those other things. Water, you'll die in 3 days without water, the most life-limiting thing on the planet. But the mood-altering substance takes precedence. And so this overstimulation, this repeated habitual overstimulation, changes how the brain functions. And so when this part of your brain, this relatively primitive part of your brain, gets overstimulated, it becomes more active, thus more dominant. So when people have a decision to make about whether to stop using, despite the fact that they know that it's the wrong thing to do, that it's the unacceptable thing to do, and that it's the unsafe thing to do, which part of the brain do you think is going to win that battle? All right, so the nucleus accumbens wins. It's more dominant. So it's not as if people in active addiction don't know that they shouldn't keep doing it. And it's not as if they don't want to stop. Wanting to stop comes from the conscious part of the brain. And everyone with the disease wants to stop. It has devastating consequences. It's detrimental, as we mentioned before. It makes your life a living hell. And so most people can remember saying to themselves, I have to stop. I can't go on like this. This is the last time. All the while, they're putting on their shoes to leave to go get more. It didn't make sense to them because they didn't understand what you now know, that they weren't using that conscious thinking part of their brain. They were using the, nucleus accumbens was driving them. Okay, so the functional structure of the brain had been altered in such a drastic way that their ability to make a logical, rational choice was no longer an option. The addicted brain couldn't care less about right versus wrong, good versus bad, acceptable versus unacceptable, or safe versus unsafe. Their frontal lobes were being overruled by the reward center, even while they're consciously saying, I don't want this anymore. Does this make sense? I mean, this is kind of out there thinking. And so without external interruption, this disease only gets worse. It's progressive, and I mentioned that before. It's progressive. This is why it takes external factors and external controls to even have a chance of getting this disease into remission. And for the vast majority of people, This has to be mandatory for them to go into a formal treatment center. Well, does the brain ever go back to normal once it's been in an addicted state? The good news is yes. So if abstinence and sobriety are maintained and there's no more overstimulation of the nucleus accumbens, in roughly 1 to 5 years, in most cases, the brain scan can return to normal. The brain is just incredibly self-preserving and resilient. I don't consider the disease to be in remission until that brain scan does return to normal, because people are still, triggered by cravings and that kind of thing. And so once it goes back to normal, then clients are able once again to use their frontal lobes to make rational choices. The bad news is that it takes 1 to 5 years to go back to normal. And it's quite difficult to calm down the nucleus accumbens once it's been, activated repeatedly. So this is why addictions therapists work really, really hard to teach clients new behaviors and new thoughts to get around those old pathways that involve the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the nucleus accumbens, memories, emotions, and pleasure. Those are hard things to get past, so we have to work really hard. We tell our clients who are in recovery that they have to change 3 primary things: the people they hang out with, the places they used to go, and the things they used to do. That's a pretty big ask. There's a lot of things in that. And so why do you think changing those 3 things are important in the process of recovery? Anybody? Because imagine, so that every time that those areas are activated with those old thoughts and old behaviors, those cravings are triggered, and the reward center becomes more active, and therefore allowing it to maintain dominance over the frontal lobes. So there's a memory loop that gets created, right? And so what does that do for the decision-making ability? They're still using that midbrain, the limbic system, to make their decisions. And so there's an emotional flavor to everything, and it's not rational because they can't access those frontal lobes. So teaching clients with addictions those new behaviors and new thought patterns helps them to develop new electrical pathways that don't activate that part of the brain that we're trying so hard to calm down. And so this is neuroplasticity. We teach you to develop those new pathways. So they're firing in a different direction and away from activating the nucleus accumbens to do something that's bad for you, that's harmful. And so humans, unfortunately, are not particularly good at behavioral modification, which is one reason why relapse is so prevalent. And so the next time clients start overstimulating that pleasure center, it regains control of the brain very fast. And so relapse is very, very dangerous, especially late relapse. And by late relapse, I'm talking about clients who've been clean and sober for a year or more. So sometimes clients think that they can have one drink and stop, but that monster takes over quickly and they lose control again quickly. And that brain scan reverts to that pathological view again. And it doesn't just happen gradually during relapse. This is why people who have that disease are always in recovery. When they make the effort to stop using and they never truly arrive at an end point of recovery, it's a lifelong process. So it's, day after day, year after year that they have to maintain sobriety. So late relapse is the primary contributor to accidental overdose, which is the #1 killer of 18 to 25-year-olds in this country, accidental overdose. And so not being able to effectively choose between right versus wrong, good versus bad, acceptable versus unacceptable, or safe versus unsafe, these are life and death choices. So if someone has been recovering from, let's say, an opiate addiction like heroin, they relapse and they try to go back to the last dose that they took, the brain no longer tolerates that amount. That person will stop breathing, and in most situations, they die. All right, that was heavy. So now let's talk about some other things. So we've already said that the addiction process occurs primarily in the limbic system of the brain, and it forms these neural pathways or reward, and it happens all in the reward circuitry. So all of those are stimulated down there. And I debated talking about neurotransmitters because that area alone is an hour-long conversation, but I decided that it's important to tell you about some common neurotransmitters and what their functions are. So we're going to talk about two types of neurotransmitters in the brain, the excitatory and the inhibitory types. Who can tell me the names of some neurotransmitters? Anybody? Okay, so what about,
Endorphins?
yeah, endorphins are neurotransmitters. Very good. So dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that you've probably heard of. It's primarily indicated in addictive behavior. It
Serotonin?
predominates. Yes, serotonin is a good one. Very good. And
GABA?
so GABA. Yeah, oh, you're a pro at this. This is really good. So dopamine predominates in the nucleus accumbens and all of those reward circuits. And so dopamine is associated with pleasure and desire. So lots of people have usually heard about dopamine and they understand those kinds of things, pleasure and desire. Endorphins, our speaker mentioned, but I'm also going to add enkephalins. And so these are released when people work out or they exert themselves in some way. But they are also, they morphine and opioids mimic endorphins and enkephalin receptors. And I wish I could tell you more about how that functions. It's so cool. But also another is glutamate, and alcohol mimics glutamate's receptors. And all of these so far are excitatory neurotransmitters. Another is norepinephrine, and it's associated with adrenaline and energy. And the last one we'll talk about on the excitatory side is acetylcholine. And nicotine mimics acetylcholine receptors. So in your brain, you have all of these receptors that kind of imagine like a plug-in. And there's these openings for those certain types of substances to go in. And they're meant for these substances that are naturally occurring. But when you add a mood-altering substance, it fills those receptors. So that's a kind of short definition of that. So some neurotransmitters that are inhibitory, someone said serotonin. And so serotonin is partially responsible for mood. And so when you hear that someone is, they talk about depression, they're talking about a decreased serotonin in their brain. Also, someone mentioned GABA, and there's GABA receptors, and those are inhibitory. And like I said, that alcohol mimics glutamate's receptors. Alcohol also mimics GABA's receptors. And then there's dopamine, which is both excitatory and inhibitory. And so I found this nice diagram that kind of lays it all out here and breaks them down into what their classes are, separates them by their type. And you can see that dopamine is on both. Histamine is also excitatory, but it didn't really relate to addiction, so I kind of left that one out. Okay, so I wanted to show you this brain. And so dopamine is released from this area. I called it the VTA earlier, which is the ventral tegmental area for short. It's all the dopamine is released into the reward centers and travels all through various parts of the brain. And so one of those places that it travels to is the amygdala. The amygdala primarily deals with emotions like fear and happiness and among other things. The VTA also sends dopamine to the nucleus accumbens that we were talking about earlier, which is responsible for the cognitive processing of motor function related to the reward and reinforcement and the regulation of slow wave sleep. So the VTA also sends dopamine up to the prefrontal cortex. Remember, that's the part that's responsible for executive functioning like planning, attention, decision making, learning, rationality, and lots of other things. And so another place that dopamine goes in the reward circuit is the hippocampus. And remember, the hippocampus is responsible for the formation of memories. And so each of these areas have dopamine receptors. And when there's an uptake of dopamine in these areas, the resulting feeling is euphoria. So the synapses are firing and your brain is all lit up on a brain scan. And so some stimulants are more vicious than others when it comes to forming addiction. And I mentioned earlier about meth, but also codeine. Codeine, most people have in their cough syrup. Morphine, cocaine, heroin, for example, they have their structures that are very similar to endorphins, and they bind to those nerve cell receptors that are reserved for endorphins, and they imitate the endorphin's pain-killing effect, and it results in euphoria. And so because of the activation of the hippocampus, a memory loop is formed and it reinforces the addiction. All right, cocaine, on the other hand, it blocks the reabsorption of dopamine and it makes the body need more cocaine. And then meth, on the other hand, floods the brain with dopamine. So they have lots of different actions to create the same addiction. And so the brain grows accustomed to using these substances and it tries to achieve balance as a defense. So it'll reduce the number of neurotransmitters or receptors that are available to that drug to try to moderate its effects. So this inhibits the system's ability to be happy or high naturally or even artificially. Lots of things going on in addiction. And so with continued stimuli, dopamine increases while serotonin decreases. And the body will try to compensate by releasing more dopamine, and serotonin responds by decreasing. And so this becomes this vicious cycle. Remember that we said that serotonin is, partially responsible for mood. So when serotonin decreases, what's the result?
Your mood decreases.
Yes, and you become depressed. So people who have depression have, a decrease in serotonin. And so when people use substances to produce that feeling of euphoria, their body responds by limiting the natural release of dopamine. Dopamine is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter. So habituation or tolerance occurs. And so this means that the user has to use more of that substance to replicate the feeling of euphoria. And so tolerance is where most, if not all, of the problems lie. And so people with addiction, if people with an addiction didn't reach tolerance, there would be no need for them to up their dosage. They could stay right where they are. They could use a small amount of the drug and get the same high every time, but that doesn't happen. So because they've developed a tolerance to a mood-altering substance, then they have to keep using more and more of it to try chasing after that feeling of euphoria. And so the brain is constantly trying to regulate itself. And this is why the disease is so progressive. So if they didn't increase their dosage, the disease process stops because overstimulation of the pleasure center is no longer happening. And they remain control over their prefrontal lobes, and they can make rational choices, good versus bad. Remember all of those. So habituation or tolerance is the key to the disease process of addiction. So you can see that, all of these brain areas kind of work together to reinforce addictive behavior. And the brain gets hijacked, limiting its ability to think and act rationally, even with obvious motivation, like the welfare of their children, or the maintenance of their relationships, or keeping their jobs, lots of different things. The addicted brain doesn't operate in the same way as the logical, non-addicted brain. And so this explains why the addicted person continues to use drugs long after the pleasure is gone. And so when people stop using abruptly, they develop withdrawal, which is a set of miserable physical symptoms that are potentially dangerous. Lots of times they experience DTs. You've probably heard of DTs, delirium tremens, seizures, headaches, sweats, muscle aches, shaking, vomiting, diarrhea, restless legs, and insomnia, and lots of other just miserable symptoms. And so all of these symptoms are confirmation that the brain is not functioning normally. All right. And so let's talk for a moment about susceptibility. So despite having repeated exposure to drugs and alcohol, most people will never develop the disease of addiction in their lifetimes. So according to SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, between 8 and 18% of the population will develop this disorder or this disease in their lifetime. But by contrast, that means that 82 to 88% of people will never develop the disease of addiction. So, and it's not a matter of exposure. The susceptibility is about other factors. What other factors do you think contribute to developing the disease of addiction?
Family history.
Family history, very good. Genetic predisposition. You can inherit the addiction genes to develop the disease of addiction, for sure. So what else? What else might? So susceptibility through genetics is one, and activation of that gene through epigenetics is a very strong one. So you can see from this graph here that this is from 2014, so it's kind of old data, but only 8.4% of people, this small fraction here, develop the disease of addiction. And then it breaks it down as to what substance they were addicted to. All right, so depending on the nature of the addiction, addictions can infiltrate every aspect of someone's life. So biologically, the changes occur at the DNA level, which forms the basis for epigenetic predisposal to addictions. And just like other diseases, addictions can be passed down to offspring, increasing their risk of developing addiction if the expression of that gene is switched on. And so if you're predisposed to addiction, the way to avoid having that gene being switched on is to avoid those addictive substances and those associated behaviors. So you make a choice on the front end, because once addiction is set in, you lose your ability to choose. And so we know in this field that addiction is a family disease, and not just in the way that it's passed down from one generation to the next, but the enabling behaviors that occur within families. Enabling is a term that has its roots in addiction. We use it all across the board, but it has its roots in addiction. And it refers to family members who inadvertently perpetuate the disease by covering up the illness and making excuses for it. Many times, family members will sweep in and rescue the person with addictions. They clean up their messes that they've made of their lives, and they don't even know that they're doing anything wrong. So when you enable someone, you take away the natural consequences of their addictive behavior, and their motivation to change often leaves right along with it. So they may see no real need to change. I mean, if somebody's going to make excuses for you or take care of any disasters that you've made, then you might have little motivation to make any changes, especially people who like the drug, they like the high. So individuals who are struggling with addiction can be experts at convincing themselves that they don't have a problem and that their addiction is, quote unquote, not really that bad. So removing the natural consequences of their behavior may just, in their eyes, provide the evidence that fuels that denial. So as much as we'd like to think we're helping and protecting people from the consequences of their issues, we cannot rob them of their rock bottom. The only way over is through. That's what I say in therapy. The only way over is through. So physiologically, people undergo chemical changes in their brains. The neural pathways are formed that drive that addiction, and it increases the difficulty of cessation. And psychologically, a ton of things are happening with mood and behavior. Sometimes people are trying to mask emotional pain by self-medicating with mood-altering substances. But those substances, if they are abused, create problems that are a world of problems all on their own. Socially, addictions have legal and moral ramifications. The environment plays a big role in the formation of addictions, their longevity, and the treatment of them. So remember, I was saying the 3 things that people have to change: people, places, and things. Lots of that is based socially, but also spiritually. So it's been said that the use of drugs and alcohol and other illicit substances may be an attempt to fill some spiritual emptiness. And consequently, the use of spirituality has been the ideal treatment source. AA is a religious-based treatment. And so we have a God-sized hole in our soul that we're always trying to fill. So often people inherit a gene in a dormant form. And so that gene may be inactive or not expressing, is how we term that. If the gene is not expressing, it does not give you susceptibility. And so these genes can be made active, though. So they can be turned on through certain behaviors and certain environmental exposures. And you can turn on a gene that was inactive in previous generations, and then you have susceptibility, at least in part. So you can carry the gene for the worst addiction in the world, but if you're not exposed to mood-altering substances, you're not going to develop the disease of addiction. All right. So somebody have a question?
Yeah, we have, probably should open it up for questions soon, Jody. We have a couple more minutes here.
Okay, I have a quick video to.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, sorry guys. This is such a good video to explain epigenetics. So if you'll bear with me, we'll hear this and then we're almost done. Oops, sorry. I did something.
Anyone like to narrate?
The person's holding a baby and it's like a tree. The baby's going to fight a tree.
And that is up into
DNA equals molecules, which makes water. A rat can be different colors.
Jody, we're not getting the audio.
And the rat, you can cook it using this cooker.
Oh gosh.
They're using molecules. You can make a brain.
Sorry guys.
I think we lost your audio, Jody.
Yeah, I paused it. I mean, I not paused it, but I muted because I was drinking water, the most life-limiting source on the planet. Sorry about that. I will share the link with Dr. Streetman, and he can share it with you guys. So, an alum of our program, Jason Abernathy, shares a devotional with me every single day from Alcoholics Anonymous. And he's helped me to understand addiction from the perspective of a recovering, someone who's in recovery. I've never had an addiction, so I don't know firsthand what that's like. And that kind of makes things challenging. I know from research and I know from theory. And I know from my heart because I care about people who are suffering. And so I wanted to leave you with this thought for the day, and I adapted it a little bit from the AA version. And so it reads, in steps 2, 3, and 11 of the 12 steps, we're told that the alcoholic must turn to a higher power for help because they are helpless in their own strength. When the drinking problem is placed in God's hands and left there, the most important decision of life was made. From that point forward, we're trusting God for the strength to keep sober. This removes the alcoholic from the center of the universe. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't know if I'd lost audio again. And it allows them to transfer their problems to a power outside of themselves. By prayer and meditation, they seek to improve their conscious contact with God, trying to live every day the way God wants them to live. This is excellent advice for all of us, regardless of what the situation is. And that's it. So thank you guys for having me, and thank you for this opportunity. If you have questions, I can take those now.
I did want to mention real quick, if anyone actually does have questions about how specific drugs affected the brain, there's actually a website called Mouse Party where it has different, what looks like lab rats, where they're each on a different drug, and you would be able to show how the synapses works when it comes to the dopamine, serotonin, the GABA, and how each one actually affects the brain differently when it comes into the reward center and the pleasure center. They'll actually describe it scientifically and how it actually goes into the brain and how it affects it chemically.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that very thorough presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. As it works here, we will write some reflection papers on the content today, and look forward to discussing reactions to your work, Dr. Helbert. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
And for those of you who are joining us remotely, thank you, and be on the lookout for announcements for more Spring Honor Seminar sessions in the future. All right, good night, everybody.